Close your eyes for a second. Picture yourself walking down a busy street. People everywhere. Strangers passing you on both sides. Conversations bleeding into each other. You are just another face in the crowd. Nobody sees you. Nobody is paying attention to you. And in the middle of all of that noise, all of that movement, all of that ordinary human chaos, someone says something that only you could ever possibly understand. A word so specific, so private, so impossibly tied to a moment in your life that no stranger could ever know it. And you stop. You freeze. Because either you are losing your mind, or someone just told you something that changes everything. You might think that kind of thing does not happen. That in a crowd of hundreds of people, no one is going to say something that is meant specifically for you. That the world is too big, too loud, too chaotic for something that precise to land exactly where it is supposed to land. And most of the time, you would be right. Most of the time, the strangers around you are talking about their own lives, their own problems, their own entirely separate worlds. They are not talking to you. They have no reason to. But sometimes, in the rarest of circumstances, someone does have a reason. Someone who has been watching. Someone who has been waiting. Someone who has been carrying a secret for years and has finally decided to let it go. And when that person opens their mouth and says the one thing that only you could ever understand, the world stops being what it was a second ago and becomes something entirely different. That is exactly what happened to Clare Monroe on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 2007. She was walking home from work in Milbrook, New York, the same route she had walked every single day for the past 9 years. And a woman she had never seen before, a woman who did not even look at her, passed her on the sidewalk and said one word. A word that had not been spoken out loud in almost a decade. A word that belonged to no one but Karen and her missing daughter. And in that single moment, 9 years of silence, 9 years of grief, 9 years of searching for a child who had vanished from her front yard when she was just 3 years old, all of it cracked open. Because what that stranger said on that crowded street set off a chain of events that led investigators to the truth about what really happened to Clare Monroe. A truth so carefully hidden that it had fooled an entire community, an entire police department, and even the family that unknowingly took Clare in. Karen did not go home right away after the woman on the sidewalk said that word. She stood there for several minutes, completely still, while the crowd continued to flow around her, people stepping around her the way water moves around a stone in a stream. She did not notice any of them. She was replaying what had just happened in her mind, over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to determine whether it was real or whether 9 years of grief had finally broken something inside her that could not be repaired. She turned around and looked in the direction the woman had gone. Walked to the corner where the woman had turned. Looked down the side street. The woman was nowhere. Vanished into the flow of pedestrians as completely as if she had never existed. Karen stood at that corner for a long time, scanning every face in the crowd, looking for anyone who might match the description of the stranger who had spoken to her. Middle-aged. Average height. Talking on a cell phone. Nothing. No one she could identify. No one who looked back at her. No one who gave any indication that they had been part of what had just happened. Karen walked home slowly that evening. Slower than usual. Her mind was racing but her feet moved at their own pace, as if her body understood that it needed time to process what her brain was still trying to catch up with. She went inside. Sat down at her kitchen table. Stared at the wall where Clare's missing person flyer still hung after all these years, slightly faded now, the corners curling, Clare's face still looking out from it with that same bright, unguarded smile that Karen remembered from every single day of her daughter's short life. Someone had said Leia. On a crowded street. Out loud. In Karen's presence. Someone who had no connection to Karen or Clare or the Monroe family in any way that Karen could identify had said the one word in the entire world that would have stopped Karen in her tracks. The one word that could not have been a coincidence. The one word that could only mean one thing, if it meant anything at all. Someone knew something. Karen sat at that table for hours that evening, turning it over and over in her mind. Was she losing her mind? Were 9 years of grief and searching and desperate, unresolved hope finally breaking something inside her that she had not noticed was cracking? Was she hearing things that were not there because her mind had finally reached its limit? Or had that woman just told her that Clare could be found? Karen did not sleep that night. She lay in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her in the dark, and she thought about Leah. About the woman on the sidewalk. About the words that had followed. You will find her. But you will not remember me. What did that mean? Who was this woman? How did she know about Leah? And why had she said what she said and then disappeared without a trace, without giving Karen anything concrete to work with, without telling her where to look or what to do next? Karen did not have those answers yet. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Something stronger than hope. Something closer to certainty. A bone-deep conviction that what had just happened on that sidewalk was real. That it meant something. That it was the beginning of something. She just did not know what yet. This is that story. Before we go any further, before we get into the details that are going to make you uncomfortable, before we talk about what it means when someone sees a crime happen right in front of them and chooses not to say a word, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. Not because I am asking you to be polite, but because this story is about what happens when people stay silent. When people look the other way. When one person has the power to change the outcome for a missing child and decides that their own fear matters more. If that kind of thing makes you feel something, if it should make you feel something, then show it. Hit like. Drop a comment right now and tell me, would you have stayed quiet? Would you have said nothing? Or do you think you would have done the right thing? And if you have not already hit subscribe, do it now, because what is coming in this video is not something you want to miss. You are going to want to be here for every single second of it. Now, let us go back to the beginning. And I mean the real beginning. Not the woman on the sidewalk. Not the anonymous note left on a doorstep in the middle of the night. We are going back to April of 1998. To a warm spring afternoon in Milbrook, New York. To a little girl named Clare Monroe who was playing in her front yard, completely unaware that in less than 180 seconds, her entire life was going to be taken from her. Karen Monroe was not a wealthy woman. She was not famous, not connected, not the kind of person who had powerful people in her corner when things went wrong. She was a single mother working double shifts at a diner on Main Street in Milbrook, a small town in the Hudson Valley where everybody knew everybody and news traveled fast. Clare's father had left before Clare was even born. He had no involvement in Clare's life, no legal rights, no contact whatsoever. Karen Monroe did not start out as a woman defined by tragedy. Before Clare disappeared, before the flyers went up, before the searches and the interviews and the slow, grinding erosion of hope that comes when a case goes cold, Karen was simply a young mother trying to do her best with what she had. She had grown up in the Hudson Valley, not far from Milbrook itself, in a family that was not wealthy but was stable. Her parents had worked hard. They had expected Karen to work hard too. And she did. Karen dropped out of high school at 17, not because she did not want to finish, but because she was pregnant and the financial reality of raising a child on her own meant that every hour she spent in a classroom was an hour she was not spending earning money. She got her GED eventually, studied for it at night after Clare was born, sitting at the kitchen table with textbooks while her daughter slept in the next room. She passed on the first try. It was one of the quiet victories of her life, the kind that no one else would have noticed or cared about, but that meant everything to Karen because it proved something to herself. That she could do hard things. That she could keep going even when everything around her was difficult. The diner on Main Street hired her when Clare was just a few months old. It was not glamorous work. Long hours on her feet, carrying plates, refilling coffee cups, making small talk with customers who sometimes tipped well and sometimes did not. But it was steady. It was reliable. And it was close enough to home that Karen could walk to work in 15 minutes and walk back in 15 minutes, which mattered when you were a single mother without a car and without anyone to help you with childcare. Karen loved Clare with the kind of fierce, uncomplicated devotion that single mothers often develop, the kind born not just from biology but from the daily reality of being the only person in the world who is responsible for keeping another human being alive and safe and loved. Every decision Karen made, what to eat, where to live, how much to spend on rent versus groceries versus clothes, was filtered through one question: what is best for Clare? And Clare, for her part, was an easy child to love. Not because she was perfect, she was not. She was 3 years old, and she was loud and curious, and sometimes stubborn in the way that all 3-year-olds are stubborn, but because she radiated a kind of natural warmth that drew people in. Neighbors on Maple Street knew her by name. The women at the diner where Karen worked asked about her regularly. Clare was one of those children who made the adults around her feel something, a tenderness, a protectiveness, a sense that this particular child mattered in a way that went beyond the ordinary bonds of family. Karen checked on Clare through the kitchen window constantly when Clare was playing outside. Not out of paranoia, exactly, but out of the heightened awareness that every parent develops when their child is within sight but not within arm's reach. The front yard on Maple Street was not a dangerous place. It was a quiet residential street in a small town where children played outside without incident every single day. But Karen watched anyway. Because that is what mothers do. They watch. They keep their eyes on the thing that matters most to them, even when there is no visible reason to worry. And then one afternoon, she looked out the window and the thing that mattered most was gone. It was just the two of them. Karen and Clare. And despite everything, despite the tight finances and the long hours and the exhaustion that came with raising a child completely on her own, Karen had managed to build something that mattered. A home. A life. A childhood for her daughter that was filled with warmth and love and the kind of quiet, ordinary happiness that most people take for granted. Clare Monroe was 3 years old in the spring of 1998. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. A smile that could fill a room without her even trying. She was the kind of child who talked constantly, who asked questions about everything, who had an imagination so vivid and so active that it sometimes surprised even Karen. And Clare had a friend. At least, she believed she had a friend. An imaginary friend named Leah. Leah lived in the garden, Clare would say. Leah came to play when no one else was around. Leah liked tea parties and liked sitting on the blanket in the front yard and liked talking to Clare when the afternoon sun was warm and the neighborhood was quiet. Karen knew about Leah, of course. Every parent of a young child with an active imagination knows about the imaginary friends. Clare talked about Leah constantly, but only at home. Only when it was just the two of them. Karen never corrected her, never told her that Leah was not real. She just smiled and let Clare have her world. It was one of those small, private things that existed only between a mother and her daughter. A secret that belonged to no one else. And for a long time, it would stay that way. Clare Monroe's inner world, the world she inhabited in those first 3 years of life, was richer and more detailed than most adults would have guessed by looking at her. She was not a complicated child in the way that adults sometimes use that word, meaning difficult or troubled. She was complicated in the way that all young children are complicated, which is to say that her interior life was vast and vivid and full of things that the adults around her could not see and did not fully understand. Leah was the most important part of that interior life. Not because Leah was real, Clare knew on some level, in the way that very young children know things without being able to articulate them, that Leah was something she had created rather than something she had found, but because Leah represented something Clare needed. A companion. A presence. Someone who was always there, always available, always willing to play and listen and be part of whatever Clare was doing. Clare talked to Leah the way some children talk to stuffed animals or dolls, except that Leah was invisible, existed only in the space Clare created for her, and responded in ways that Clare entirely controlled. Leah liked certain games and did not like others. Leah had preferences about where to sit and what to eat at the tea parties. Leah had a personality, quirks, habits, a whole imagined life that Clare had built piece by piece over the course of months. Karen never pushed Clare on it. Never asked too many questions about Leah or tried to convince Claire that Leah was not real. She understood, instinctively, that this was something Claire needed to work through on her own, in her own time, and that interfering would do more harm than good. So she let it be. Let Claire have Leah. Let her play in the front yard with her dolls and her blanket and her invisible friend, and smiled when she watched through the window, because it was one of the small, ordinary pleasures of motherhood that she treasured. On the afternoon of April 15th, Claire was in the middle of one of these tea parties when the man in the vest appeared. Claire did not feel afraid when he approached. He did not look threatening. He did not move in a way that suggested danger. He knelt down beside her blanket, which put him at her eye level, a deliberate choice that Claire would not have understood at the time, but that was designed to make her feel safe, to make him seem less imposing, less like an authority figure and more like a peer. He spoke softly. He smiled. He used her name, which immediately established a sense of familiarity, a sense that this person knew her, knew about her, was someone connected to her life in some way. He said her mommy had sent him. That there was a surprise waiting for her. Claire had no reason to doubt this. She was 3 years old. She did not yet have the capacity to evaluate the credibility of what an adult was telling her. If an adult said something, especially an adult who seemed friendly and who knew her name, Claire believed it. That was how 3-year-olds work. They trust. They take the world at face value because they have not yet learned that the world is not always what it appears to be. So Claire stood up, took the man's hand, and walked with him toward the van. She did not look back at the blanket. Did not say goodbye to Leah. Did not even think about it, because in her mind, she was going somewhere her mommy had sent her, which meant she would see her mommy soon, which meant everything was fine. It was not fine. On April 15th of 1998, it was a warm Tuesday afternoon. Karen had just come home from her shift at the diner. The sun was out. The air was soft. And Claire was outside in the front yard of their house on Maple Street, exactly where Karen expected her to be. She was sitting on a blanket, dolls arranged in a circle around her, setting up one of her elaborate tea parties. And she was talking to Leah. Karen could hear her through the open window, chattering away in that high, bright voice that only a 3-year-old can produce. Claire was happy. She was safe. She was right there, visible through the kitchen window, no more than 30 feet from where Karen was standing inside the house. Karen went to do laundry. The basement was directly below the kitchen. She needed to switch the clothes from the washer to the dryer. It was something she did every day. Something so routine, so automatic, that it barely registered as a conscious decision. She would be gone 2 minutes. Maybe 3. She moved quickly, transferred the wet clothes, started the dryer, and headed back upstairs. When she looked out the kitchen window, Claire was gone. The blanket was still there. The dolls were still arranged in their perfect circle, undisturbed, as if Claire had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of everything. But Claire was not there. The yard was empty. The street was quiet. Karen did not panic immediately. She called Claire's name. Walked outside. Checked the backyard. Looked up and down Maple Street. Called again. Louder this time. Nothing. No answer. No sign of her daughter anywhere. She checked the neighbor's yard. Went back inside. Looked out every window in the house. Called Claire's name again and again until her voice was shaking. Claire was gone. Karen called 911 with hands that would not stop trembling. She told the operator exactly what had happened. Her daughter was missing. 3 years old. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. Wearing a yellow dress. Had been playing in the front yard less than 5 minutes ago. Was now gone without any trace. Police arrived within 10 minutes. Search teams were assembled. Dogs were brought in to track Claire's scent. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions, covering every inch of ground they could. Detective Paul Harrison arrived and immediately took control of the scene. He organized the search, set up a command center, and sat Karen down in her own living room to go through everything that had happened, minute by minute. Harrison was thorough. He asked the questions that every detective asks in a situation like this. Was there anyone in Claire's life who might have a reason to take her? A custody dispute. A family member with a grudge. Someone who had threatened Karen or Claire in any way. Karen answered every question honestly. There was no one. Claire's father had never been part of their lives. Karen had no enemies, no conflicts, nothing that suggested anyone would have a motive to take her daughter. This was not a situation that fit any of the usual patterns. There was no ransom demand, no custody battle, no obvious reason in the world why anyone would walk into that yard and take a 3-year-old child. But the dogs told a different story. They picked up Claire's scent and followed it across the yard, down the short path to the front of the house, and directly to the curb. The edge of the street. And then the scent disappeared. Completely and entirely. The dogs lost it at the pavement, which meant one thing and only one thing. Someone had put Claire in a vehicle, and they had driven away. Harrison personally went door to door along Maple Street. He knocked on every single house within a 2-block radius. He asked every neighbor the same set of questions. Did you see anything unusual this afternoon? Did you see any vehicles you did not recognize? Did you hear anything? Were you looking out your window at any point around 3:45 in the afternoon? Almost everyone said no. They had been inside. They had not been paying attention to the street. They had not seen anything, had not heard anything, had nothing useful to offer. House after house, the same answer. Nothing. No one saw what happened. No one could help. Almost everyone. There was one person on Maple Street who had seen everything. One person who had watched the entire thing unfold from start to finish, from less than 50 feet away, through a front window with a clear and unobstructed view of the Monroe front yard. One person who had watched a man walk up to a 3-year-old girl, talk to her for less than 30 seconds, and lead her directly to a waiting van. One person who had watched that van pull away from the curb and drive off down the street. One person who, when Detective Harrison knocked on her door that evening, looked him in the eye and lied. Understanding why Diane Foster stayed silent for 9 years requires understanding what agoraphobia actually is, not as a label or a diagnosis but as a lived experience. Agoraphobia is not simply being afraid of the outdoors. It is not a preference for staying home. It is not introversion taken to an extreme. It is a genuine, debilitating fear response that the brain generates in connection with situations where escape might be difficult or help might not be available. For someone with severe agoraphobia, the outside world is not just uncomfortable. It is genuinely terrifying in a way that is difficult for people without the condition to fully comprehend. Diane's agoraphobia had developed gradually over the course of several years before Clare Monroe disappeared. It started with small things. An increasing reluctance to go to crowded places. A growing sense of anxiety when she was far from home. A tendency to cancel plans, to find reasons not to leave the house, to shrink her world bit by bit until the boundaries of her comfortable existence had contracted to the 4 walls of her living room. By 1998, Diane had not left her property in over a year. Her world had become the interior of her house, the view from her window, and the handful of phone calls and deliveries that kept her functioning. She had no close friends. No social life. No one she confided in about the depth of what she was experiencing. She managed her condition in isolation, the way many people with severe anxiety manage it, by avoiding the thing that triggered it entirely, which in Diane's case meant avoiding the outside world altogether. The window was her compromise. Her way of staying connected to something beyond her own 4 walls without actually having to cross the threshold. She could watch the neighborhood from behind the glass. Could observe the rhythms of daily life on Maple Street. Could see children play and parents walk dogs and neighbors wave to each other across the street. It was a kind of second-hand living, a life lived at one remove from actual participation, and it was lonely in ways that Diane did not fully acknowledge even to herself. When the man in the vest looked up at her window on April 15 of 1998, Diane's agoraphobia did not just prevent her from running outside to intervene. It prevented her from even considering it as a real option. The idea of throwing open her front door, of stepping onto that porch, of shouting across the street loud enough to stop what was happening, it was not something Diane's brain could process as possible. It was as completely outside the range of things she could do as it would be for someone without arms to reach for something. The fear was too total, too consuming, too much a part of how she understood her own capabilities and limitations. And then the man pointed at her house. And a new layer of fear was added on top of the existing one. Now it was not just that going outside was terrifying. It was that speaking up, in any way, through any channel, was dangerous. The man knew where she lived. The man had made sure she understood that. And for someone who was already paralyzed by fear, the addition of an explicit threat, even one communicated without words, was devastating. Diane's silence was not a moral choice, not in the way that most people would understand that phrase. It was not a deliberation in which she weighed the right thing to do against the easy thing to do, and chose the easy thing. It was more like drowning. She was already underwater, already unable to breathe, already incapable of the most basic actions that a healthy person would take without thinking. The man's threat simply pushed her deeper. That does not excuse what she did. Or rather, what she did not do. A child was taken because Diane did not speak. That fact does not change regardless of the reason for the silence. But it explains why 9 years passed before Diane found the courage to open her mouth. It was not 9 years of indifference. It was 9 years of a woman trapped inside her own fear, watching the consequences of her silence play out in real time, one day at a time, powerless to undo what had already been done, but slowly, gradually, building the strength to do something about what could still be changed. Her name was Diane Foster. Diane lived in the house directly across the street from the Monroe home. She was 42 years old. And she suffered from a condition that had, for years, kept her almost entirely confined to the inside of her own house. Agoraphobia. A severe, debilitating fear of the outside world so intense that the mere thought of stepping through her front door could trigger a full panic attack. Racing heart. Shallow breathing. A crushing sense of dread that made even the idea of going outside feel impossible. Diane had not left her property in over a year by the time Clare Monroe disappeared. She had groceries delivered. She had no social life outside of the bare minimum interactions required to exist. She communicated with the outside world through phone calls and, occasionally, through the window. Because that was the one thing Diane could still do without her fear consuming her. She could sit by her front window and watch. Watch the street. Watch the neighbors come and go. Watch the children play. Watch the seasons change. It was how she stayed tethered to a world she could no longer bring herself to be part of. And on April 15th of 1998, at 3:47 in the afternoon, Diane Foster was in that exact spot, in that exact chair, looking out that exact window, when a white van pulled up to the curb in front of the Monroe house. 2 men got out. Diane watched them. She watched them the way she watched everything that happened on that street, with a quiet, detached attention, cataloging details without necessarily understanding why. But something about these 2 men made her sit up straighter. Something about the way they moved made a feeling rise in her chest that she could not immediately identify. It was not quite fear. Not yet. It was something closer to unease. A sense that something about this moment did not fit. One of the men was wearing a vest over his shirt. It was the kind of vest that organizations put on their workers or volunteers. The kind with a logo on the front. The kind that municipal services use, or charities, or community outreach programs. The kind of vest that, when someone sees it on a stranger approaching their home, makes them lower their guard. Makes them think, oh, this person is official. This person belongs here. This person is here to help. The man in the vest walked quickly across the lawn toward the front yard where Claire was playing. Diane watched him kneel down beside the blanket, beside the little girl with the blonde hair and the yellow dress, and the dolls arranged in a circle around her. He said something to Claire. Diane could not hear the words through the glass, could not make out the conversation from across the street. But she watched Claire's face. Watched the little girl look up at the man, listen to whatever he was saying, and then nod. The man said something else, and Claire stood up. She stood up from her blanket, from her tea party, from her imaginary world with Leia, and she started walking toward the van. Diane's chest tightened. Something was wrong. She could feel it, the way you can sometimes feel that a moment has shifted before you can articulate exactly how. That man was not a neighbor. She had lived across the street long enough to know every face, every person who came and went on Maple Street. That man did not belong here. And that little girl should not be going with him. But Diane did not move. Did not call out. Did not reach for the phone. The second man, who had been standing by the van the entire time, opened the sliding door. The man in the vest picked Claire up, lifted her off the ground, carried her to the van, and placed her inside. Then he closed the door. And then he looked up. He turned his head and looked directly at Diane's window. Directly at her. As if he had known she was there the entire time. As if he had been waiting for that exact moment to make sure she understood something. Diane gasped. Instinctively stepped back from the glass. But it was too late. He had already seen her. He had seen her watching. The man's expression did not change. It did not twist into anger. It did not flash with panic or guilt or any emotion that might suggest he was worried about being caught. His face was calm. Almost completely blank. And then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. He brought one finger to his lips. The universal gesture for silence. Be quiet. Do not speak. Do not say a word. Then he did something else. He pointed. But he did not point at Diane. He pointed at her mailbox. At the numbers on the front of her house. At the address that identified exactly where she lived and exactly who she was. He held his gaze on her for another second, making sure the message had landed, making sure there was no possible way she could misunderstand what he was communicating. He knew where she lived. He knew who she was. And if she said anything, if she told anyone what she had just seen, he would come back. The man in the vest turned away from her window without another word, without another glance. He walked calmly to the passenger side of the van, opened the door, and got in. The second man was already behind the wheel. The engine started. The van pulled away from the curb, rolled down Maple Street at a normal speed, turned the corner at the end of the block, and disappeared from view. The whole thing, from the moment the van pulled up to the moment it drove away, had taken less than 90 seconds. Less than a minute and a half. That was all it took to steal a child from her own front yard in broad daylight, in the middle of a residential neighborhood, on a street where people lived and walked and went about their daily lives. Diane sat back in her chair. Her whole body was trembling. Her hands were shaking so badly she gripped the armrests to keep them still. Her heart was hammering against her ribs with such force that she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, behind her eyes. She had just watched a man take a little girl. She had watched it happen, had seen every single second of it, and she had done nothing to stop it. She should call the police right now. She should pick up the phone and dial 911 and tell them exactly what she saw. The van, the men, the vest, the direction they drove. All of it. Every detail. She had seen enough to give investigators something to work with. She had seen enough that Clare Monroe might still be found. But Diane did not pick up the phone. Because picking up the phone meant talking to someone. Talking to someone meant explaining what she had seen, which meant explaining where she had been when she saw it, which meant admitting that she had been sitting at her window, which meant acknowledging the fact that she spent most of her days locked inside this house, too afraid to go outside, too paralyzed by her own fear to participate in the world like a normal person. It meant exposure. It meant attention. It meant people knowing about her, knowing where she lived, knowing what she was, knowing what she looked like. And more than all of that, it meant the man in the vest knowing that she had spoken. The man who had looked directly at her. Who had pointed at her house. Who had made it unmistakably clear what would happen if she opened her mouth. So Diane stayed in her chair. And she stayed quiet. 2 hours later there was a knock on her door. Detective Paul Harrison, standing on her porch, badge in hand, asking if she had seen anything unusual on Maple Street that afternoon. Diane opened the door but kept the chain lock on. She spoke through the gap. Her mouth was dry. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the doorframe just to keep herself steady. Harrison asked the question plainly. Had she been home that afternoon? Had she seen anything unusual on the street around 3:45? Even small details, he said. A vehicle she did not recognize. A person she did not know walking by. Anything at all out of the ordinary. Diane looked at him through the gap in the door. She thought about the van. About the man in the vest. About the little girl walking away from her blanket without looking back. About the finger pressed to the lips. About the pointing at the mailbox. About the look in that man's eyes that said, I see you, and I know exactly where you are. And she said no? She told Harrison she had been in the back of the house all afternoon. That she had not been near the front window. That she had not seen anything and had nothing to offer. Harrison thanked her. Said he was sorry she could not help. Moved on to the next house. Diane closed the door. Locked it. Walked back to her window and sat down in her chair. And from that chair, she watched Clare Monroe's world collapse. She watched Karen come back outside, frantic, looking up and down the street, calling Claire's name. Watched the police cars arrive, one after another, lights spinning. Watched the search teams spread out across the neighborhood. Watched Karen standing in her front yard with her hands pressed over her mouth, staring at the blanket where her daughter had been playing just minutes before. Watched the flyers go up in the days that followed, Claire's face printed on white paper, stapled to telephone poles and taped to shop windows all along Main Street. Watched Karen put them up and watched them fade in the sun and watched Karen take them down and replace them with new ones. Diane watched all of it. And she said nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. And through all of it, every single day, Diane Foster sat at her window and watched Clare Monroe live with the consequences of what had happened on that street. Watched her go to work at the diner every morning and come home every evening. Watched her walk the same route, day after day, as if by retracing the same steps she might somehow stumble across the daughter who had been stolen from her. Watched the hope in Karen's posture slowly, gradually, painfully diminish. Watched something harder take its place. Not hopelessness, exactly. Something more like endurance. The kind of quiet, stubborn refusal to give up that does not look like hope anymore but has not quite become its opposite. And through every single one of those days, Diane Foster carried the weight of what she had seen. What she had not done. What she had chosen not to say. It sat inside her like a stone, heavy and cold, and it did not get lighter with time. If anything, it got heavier. Because every day that Clare Monroe was not found was another day that Diane's silence had contributed to. Every day that Karen walked that route looking for answers was another day that Diane had the answer and was choosing, consciously and deliberately, not to give it. She told herself she had no choice. The man knew where she lived. If she spoke, he would come back. If she told the police what she had seen, she would be putting herself in danger. Real danger. The kind of danger that someone who threatened a witness in broad daylight and pointed at her house was capable of following through on. But underneath that justification, underneath the fear and the self-preservation and the agoraphobia that made even the thought of stepping outside feel like drowning, Diane knew the truth about herself. She was not just afraid. She was a coward. She had watched a child be taken. She had seen the face of the man who did it. She had the information that could have led investigators directly to Claire. And she had chosen her own comfort, her own safety, her own small and shrinking world over the life of a 3-year-old girl. That knowledge lived inside Diane for 9 years. 9 years of guilt. 9 years of watching. 9 years of silence. The 9 years between Claire's disappearance and the encounter on Main Street were not a single continuous experience for Clare Monroe. They were not one long stretch of uniform grief. They were something more complicated than that, more textured, more layered, because life does not pause when something terrible happens to you. Life keeps going. The bills keep arriving. The shifts at the diner keep starting at the same time every morning. The sun keeps coming up and going down. And you have to figure out how to keep functioning inside all of that normalcy while carrying something inside you that is the opposite of normal. Karen went through phases. There was the initial phase, the weeks and months right after Clare disappeared, when the grief was so raw and so immediate that it was almost physical. A weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. A constant, low-grade panic that never fully subsided, even when she was at work, even when she was doing something as mundane as washing dishes or folding laundry. The awareness, every single second of every single day, that her daughter was somewhere in the world and Karen did not know where, and that somewhere in that world, Clare might be afraid or hurt or crying for her mother and Karen could not reach her. Then there was the phase of frantic searching. The flyers. The phone calls to other police departments, to missing children organizations, to anyone who might have information or might know someone who did. The letters Karen wrote to newspapers, to television producers, to anyone with a platform who might help spread the word. The meetings with Harrison, who kept her updated on the investigation even as the leads dried up one by one and the case grew colder with each passing month. And then there was the phase that came after all of that, the phase that lasted the longest, the phase that defined the shape of Karen's life for most of those 9 years. The phase of endurance. Of getting up every morning and going to work and coming home and doing it again the next day, not because she had any particular hope that today would be different, but because giving up was not something Clare Monroe knew how to do. She kept the missing person flyer on the wall of her kitchen. A single copy, the original that the police had made in the first week, pinned to the wall where she could see it every time she walked into the room. She did not take it down. Did not replace it with a newer one. Just left it there, slightly faded now, the corners curling, Claire's face looking out from it with that bright, unguarded smile that Karen remembered from every single day of her daughter's short life. Karen walked the same route home from the diner every single day. Not because she expected to find Clare on that route. Not because there was any logical reason to believe that walking the same streets over and over would lead to any new information. But because it was something. It was a way of staying connected to the search, of keeping herself physically present in the space where Clare had last been seen, of refusing to let the town move on without her. And the town did move on. That is what towns do. The initial shock faded. The flyers stopped being the first thing people noticed when they walked down Main Street. The conversations shifted to other things. New families moved in. Children grew up. Life continued in all of its ordinary, relentless momentum. But Karen did not move on. Could not move on. Would not move on. Because somewhere out there, Clare was still missing. And as long as Clare was missing, Karen's life was suspended in a kind of permanent present tense, a state of waiting that never resolved, never concluded, never gave her the closure that would have allowed her to begin healing. Until one evening in March of 2007, when everything changed. Diane watched the news every night at 6 o'clock. It was part of her routine, one of the few anchors that kept her days from blending into one another. She watched it the way she did most things, from her chair, from behind glass, observing without participating. On this particular evening, the news anchor was reporting on a major arrest that had taken place earlier that day. Federal agents had shut down an illegal adoption ring. The operation had been running for over 15 years, spanning multiple states across the country. 12 people had been taken into custody. The ring had kidnapped dozens of children taken from parks and front yards and shopping centers and driveways, and had sold them to families who wanted children but could not or would not go through the legal adoption process. The prices charged for each child ranged from $20,000 to $50,000 or more, depending on the age and characteristics of the child. Diane watched the footage of the arrests on television. People in handcuffs being led out of buildings. Offices being searched, evidence being collected, boxes carried out by agents in windbreakers. And then the screen switched to a photograph. A still image of one of the suspects. A man in his 50s, standing in front of a nondescript building, wearing a vest over his shirt. A vest with a logo on it. For a long moment Diane did not move. Did not breathe. just stood there in front of the television with her hands hanging at her sides and the light from the screen flickering across her face, staring at that photograph of the suspect in the vest. Her mind was not processing it the way a normal mind processes information. It was not a calm, rational assessment. It was something closer to recognition. The deep, gut-level recognition that comes when you see something you have been looking at in your memory for years and suddenly see it again, right in front of you, in the real world, in a context that confirms everything you have been afraid of. 9 years. 9 years she had looked at that vest in her memory. 9 years she had pictured it every time she thought about that afternoon. The logo. The way it sat on the man's chest. The way it made him look official, trustworthy, like someone who belonged in that neighborhood, in that yard, near that child. She had replayed the image so many times that it had become almost abstract, a symbol more than a memory, something she carried inside her like a scar that had healed over but never fully disappeared. And now there it was. On television. In a photograph. Connected to a name and a face and a criminal organization that had been doing exactly what Diane had always feared it was doing. Taking children. Selling them. Making them disappear. Diane sat back down. Her legs would not hold her up anymore. She sat in her chair and she stared at the television even after the segment had ended and the news had moved on to other stories, other crimes, other tragedies that had nothing to do with her or with Clare Monroe or with the afternoon that had defined the rest of her life. And then, very quietly, in the silence of her living room with the television now showing something she was not watching at all, Diane Foster allowed herself to think something she had not permitted herself to think in 9 years. Maybe it was not too late. Diane stood up from her chair so fast she nearly knocked it over. She moved closer to the television. Stared at the photograph. Because that vest, that logo, that exact style and design, was what she had seen 9 years ago on the man who walked into Clare Monroe's front yard and took Clare. This was the organization. This was the ring that had taken Clare Monroe. The ring that had put her in that van and driven her away from everything she had ever known. And if that ring had been selling children to other families, that meant something that Diane had not allowed herself to hope for in 9 years. Clare might still be alive. Not dead. Not gone forever. Not something that could never be undone. Clare might be alive somewhere in this country, living under a different name, with a different family, going to school and making friends and growing up without ever knowing who she really was or where she really came from. She might be 12 years old right now. She might be perfectly healthy and perfectly safe, just lost. Lost to herself as much as to everyone else. Diane turned off the television and sat in silence for a very long time. For 9 years she had carried her guilt under the assumption that it did not matter. That even if she had spoken up, even if she had told the police everything she saw that afternoon, it would have been too late. That Clare was gone in a way that could not be reversed, that whatever had happened to her after she was put in that van was something no amount of information could undo. That assumption had been a kind of protection. A way of justifying her silence even to herself. It was too late anyway, she would think. Even if I had said something, it would not have changed anything. But now she knew that was not true. Clare might be alive. And if Clare was alive, then the information Diane had been sitting on for 9 years, the description of the van, the men, the vest, the direction they had driven, all of it could still matter. All of it could still lead investigators to the truth. The question was whether Diane was willing to finally speak. She spent 3 weeks turning it over in her mind. 3 weeks of picking up the phone and putting it back down. 3 weeks of starting to write a letter and then throwing it away. 3 weeks of standing at her window, looking across the street at Clare Monroe, watching her go through the same motions she had gone through every day for 9 years, and thinking about what it would mean to finally end this. What it would cost Diane to open her mouth after all this time. What it would give Karen if she did. Those 3 weeks were the longest of Diane's life, longer even than the years of silence that had preceded them. Because during those years she had at least had the comfort of believing that speaking up would not have made a difference anyway. That Clare was gone in a way that could not be undone. That her silence, as terrible as it was, had not ultimately changed the outcome. But now that comfort was gone. Now she knew that Clare might be alive. That the information Diane had been sitting on for 9 years could still matter. Could still lead to something real. And every single day she spent not acting on that information was another day that Clare remained lost. Another day that Clare Monroe walked home from the diner, hoping for a sign, and finding nothing. Diane watched Karen through her window during those 3 weeks with a new kind of attention. A more focused, more deliberate kind of watching than she had done for years. She watched Karen's face as she passed by on her way home from work. Watched the way Karen's eyes still drifted, even after all this time, to the spot in the front yard where Clare had been playing that afternoon in 1998. Watched the way Karen's shoulders carried a weight that was invisible to everyone else but unmistakable to Diane, who had been watching her carry it for 9 years. Diane thought about what it would mean to tell Karen the full truth. Not just the abstract truth about Clare being alive somewhere. The complete truth. The truth that included the fact that Diane had been sitting at her window when Clare was taken. That she had watched it happen from start to finish. That she had seen the men in the van and the vest and everything else. That she had lied to Detective Harrison when he came to her door. That she had carried this information for 9 years and done absolutely nothing with it. That truth was not something Diane could give Karen directly. Not in person. Not in a way that would require Diane to face Karen, to look into the eyes of the woman whose daughter she had failed to save, and say those words out loud. The shame of that moment, the weight of it, was something Diane could not bear to imagine. It was, in some ways, even harder to think about than the fear of the man in the vest. Because at least with the man in the vest, the fear had a clear, identifiable source. With Karen, the fear was shapeless, formless, rooted in guilt so deep that Diane could not find the bottom of it. So Diane found a middle path. A way to give Karen enough information to start looking again without revealing the full depth of her own failure. A way to set things in motion without ever having to stand in front of Clare Monroe and explain herself. It was not a perfect solution. It was not a brave solution, not in the way that true bravery would have looked in this situation. But it was the most that Diane could bring herself to do. And in the end, as it turned out, it was enough. Diane could not go to the police directly. The thought of walking into a police station, of sitting in a room with strangers, of answering questions in person, of being seen and identified and connected to the events of that afternoon in 1998, was too much. Her agoraphobia would not allow it. Even after 9 years of carrying this secret, even after learning that Clare might still be alive, the fear of exposure, of becoming visible, of being known, was still too strong for Diane to walk into a room and hand the truth to a detective. But there was another way. She could give the information to Karen without ever being seen. Without ever being identified. She could say just enough in a public place, where the crowd would provide cover, to let Karen know that Clare could be found. And then she could disappear back into the shadows where she had been hiding for all these years, leaving it to Karen to take the information the rest of the way. Diane planned it carefully. She studied Karen's routine. Figured out exactly which days Karen walked down Main Street after her shift at the diner, exactly what times she passed through the busiest stretch of downtown, exactly where the crowd would be thick enough for Diane to blend in and disappear without anyone paying attention. She chose a day. April 10th of 2007. She chose a spot on the sidewalk. She chose the words she would say. And she chose one other thing, something small but crucial. She chose a word that only Karen would recognize. A word that would prove, instantly and undeniably, that this was not random. That this was not a coincidence. That whoever was speaking to Karen knew something that no one else on earth could know. Leah. That morning was not easy for Diane. It was, in fact, one of the hardest things she had ever done in her life, and she had done hard things before. The agoraphobia did not disappear because she had made a decision. It did not step aside and let her pass because she had finally decided to do the right thing. It was there, in her chest, in her throat, in the way her hands shook and her vision blurred slightly at the edges and her breathing came in short, shallow bursts that were not quite enough to fill her lungs. She stood at her front door for several minutes before she opened it. Just stood there, hand on the doorknob, feeling the cold metal against her palm, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood outside, the distant hum of traffic, a dog barking somewhere down the street, the ordinary sounds of a world that she had been shut out of for so long. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her fingertips. She opened the door. The air hit her face, and the full weight of being outside, of being visible, of being a person in the world who could be seen and noticed and identified, crashed over her like a wave. For a moment she thought she might not be able to do it. Thought she might have to close the door and go back inside and admit that even after 9 years of guilt, even after learning that Clare might be alive, her fear was still too strong. But she did not close the door. She stepped outside. One foot, then the other. Down the porch steps. Along the sidewalk. Into the flow of people moving through downtown Milbrook on an ordinary April afternoon. And for every single step she took, a voice in her head was telling her to turn around, go home, stay safe. And for every single step she took, another voice, quieter but no less insistent, was telling her to keep going. The quieter voice won. On the morning of April 10th, Diane did something she had not done in 8 months. She got dressed, put on a coat, walked to her front door, and opened it. Stepped outside. The air hit her skin and her heart rate spiked immediately, the familiar flood of anxiety that came every time she crossed that threshold. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was shallow. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to turn around, go back inside, lock the door, stay safe. She did not turn around. She walked to Main Street. Positioned herself along the route she knew Karen would take. Pulled out her cell phone and held it to her ear, as if she were in the middle of a phone call, so that when she spoke it would look like she was talking to someone on the other end of the line and not to the woman passing her on the sidewalk. She started walking. Clare Monroe was coming toward her. Diane could see her in the crowd, moving at her usual pace, head slightly down, tired from another shift, another day of going through the motions of a life that had been hollowed out by loss. Diane timed her steps. Adjusted her position so that the two of them would pass each other at exactly the right moment, close enough to be heard but moving fast enough that Karen would not have time to stop her, would not have time to turn around and find her in the crowd. And then, as Diane passed Clare Monroe on that sidewalk, she said it. Leah. She said it quietly. Not loudly enough to turn heads. Not so softly that it might be missed. Just clearly, deliberately, in a tone that sounded as natural as any words spoken by any person on any phone call on any busy street in any small town in America. But Karen heard it. Diane saw the effect immediately. Saw Karen's body go rigid. Saw her stop walking. Saw the color drain from her face. Diane kept walking. Did not slow down. Did not look back. And as she moved past Karen, she said the second thing. The message she needed Karen to understand. You will find her. But you won't remember me. Then Diane turned the corner, quickened her pace, and disappeared into a side street. She did not stop walking until she was 3 blocks away, hidden again, invisible again, back in the world where no one could see her, and she could not see anyone. She had done it. She had said the words. She had given Karen the one thing that might start the process of finding Clare. But Diane knew that those words alone, as meaningful as they were to Karen, were not enough. Karen needed more than hope. She needed specifics. She needed details that investigators could actually use. The description of the van. The men. The vest. The route they had taken when they drove away. The things Diane had watched from her window on that afternoon 9 years ago, and had been carrying in her memory ever since. Diane could not give that information in person. Could not risk direct contact with Karen or anyone else. But she could write it down. She could put it on paper and leave it somewhere Karen would find it, and Karen could take it to the police herself. Over the next 2 days, Diane sat at her kitchen table and wrote. She wrote and rewrote the note more times than she could count, trying to include enough detail to be genuinely useful without including anything that would reveal who she was. She described the van as best she could remember it. Light-colored, white or possibly light gray, unmarked on the outside except for what looked like a logo or emblem on the side. She described the two men, their approximate builds, their clothing, the way one of them wore the vest with the organization's logo. She wrote about the direction the van had gone when it left Maple Street, which road it had taken out of town. She wrote all of it down in plain, straightforward language, the kind of language that a detective would be able to read and immediately understand. And at the end of the note, she wrote an apology. Not a long one. Not an explanation of why she had stayed silent for 9 years, because an explanation would have pointed directly back to her, would have made it obvious that the person who wrote this note was someone who had been watching from across the street. Just a simple, quiet apology for not speaking sooner. For the years of silence. For the pain she had caused by choosing fear over truth. She did not sign it. Did not put her name anywhere on the page. Did not include any detail that could be traced back to her identity or her address. On April 13th of 2007, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the street was empty and the neighborhood was completely dark and silent, Diane Foster opened her front door for the second time in 3 days. She walked across Maple Street, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her own ears, crossed the pavement to Clare Monroe's front porch, and placed the envelope on the doorstep. Then she turned around, walked back across the street, went inside her own house, locked the door behind her, and sat down at her window. And she waited for morning. The hours between 3 in the morning and 7 in the morning were the longest Diane had ever spent in that chair. She did not sleep. Could not have slept even if she had wanted to. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the doorstep across the street where the envelope now sat, invisible in the dark, and she waited. She thought about what would happen when Karen found it. Imagine Karen opening the door, seeing the envelope, picking it up. Imagine the moment Karen read the words inside. Imagine what Karen's face would look like, the shift from confusion to shock to something that looked like desperate, terrified hope. Imagine Karen running back inside, grabbing her keys, driving to the police station without a word to anyone. She thought about what would happen after that. About Harrison reading the note. About the investigation that might follow. About whether any of it would actually lead anywhere, whether the information Diane had given was specific enough, detailed enough, useful enough to actually help find Claire after all these years. There was no guarantee. She knew that. She had done what she could with what she had. But she could not control what happened next. And she thought about herself. About what she had just done. About the fact that for the first time in 9 years she had acted. Had done something instead of nothing. Had taken a step, however small, however indirect, toward undoing a wrong that she had been carrying inside her for almost a decade. It did not feel like redemption. It was too small for that, too quiet, too incomplete. But it felt like something. Like the first movement after a very long stillness. Like a door that had been locked for years finally cracking open, just a little, just enough to let some light through. The sky began to lighten around 6:30. The street turned from black to gray to the pale blue of an early spring morning. Birds were singing somewhere down the block. The neighborhood was waking up, the way it woke up every morning, quietly and without drama, people moving through their routines, lights coming on in windows, cars starting in driveways. Now I need to pause here for just a second. Because if you are still watching at this point, if you have stayed with this story through everything we have covered so far, through the disappearance, through Diane's silence, through 9 years of Karen refusing to give up, through the moment Diane finally found the courage to speak, then you already know this story is not letting you go. Drop a comment right now. Tell me you are still here. I want to see it. I want to know who is paying attention, because what is about to happen in the next part of this story is the part that makes everything before it matter. And I promise you, you do not want to miss it. If you have not already hit like and subscribe, do it now. Because we are about to find out what happened when that envelope landed on Clare Monroe's doorstep. And it changes everything. And at 7 o'clock, Clare Monroe's front door opened. Karen had been opening her front door at the same time every morning for years. Same routine. Same steps. Grab the keys, step outside, pull the door shut behind her. She barely thought about it anymore. It was automatic. Muscle memory. The kind of action that happens without conscious decision because it has been performed so many times that the body simply does it. But on April 13th, something was different. The envelope was right there on the step, sitting in the exact spot where packages and mail sometimes ended up when the delivery was made before dawn. It was a plain white envelope. No stamp. No return address. No writing on the outside at all. Just a sealed envelope sitting on the concrete, as if someone had placed it there very deliberately and very quietly, without wanting to be seen doing so. Karen picked it up, turned it over in her hands, looked up and down the street to see if anyone was watching, if anyone gave any indication of having been there moments before. The street was empty. The morning was gray and cool. Nothing moved except a car turning the corner at the far end of the block. Karen opened the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. She unfolded it and started reading. And the world changed. The note was handwritten in careful, steady script. It described a van. It described two men. It described a vest with a logo on it. It described the direction the van had gone when it left Maple Street. It described details that Karen had never heard before, details that the police had never shared with her, details that could only have come from someone who had actually been there, who had actually seen what happened on that afternoon 9 years ago. Someone had seen Clare being taken. Someone had watched the whole thing happen and had said nothing for 9 years and was only now, after all this time, coming forward. Karen read the note twice. Then a third time. Then she stood on her front porch in the cool morning air and she stared at the paper in her hands and she felt something shift inside her chest, something fundamental, something tectonic, like a fault line that had been locked in place for years suddenly releasing. She went back inside, grabbed her car keys, and drove to the police station. At 7 o'clock, Clare Monroe opened her front door to leave for work. The envelope was right there on the step. Karen picked it up, opened it, and read what was inside. Diane watched from across the street. Watched Karen's face change as she read. Watched the way her expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like shock, and then to something that looked like desperate, terrified hope. Watched her run back inside the house. Watched her come back out a minute later with her car keys in her hand and her face set in an expression of absolute determination. Watched her get in the car and drive away fast. Diane knew exactly where she was going. To the police station. To Detective Harrison. To finally, after 9 years, give the case a reason to be reopened. And in doing so, Diane Foster had finally done what she should have done on that afternoon in April of 1998. She had told the truth. She had given Karen the chance to find her daughter. And she had set in motion a sequence of events that would eventually lead investigators to the place where Clare Monroe had been living all along, under a name that was not her own, in a family that did not know they had taken her. Detective Paul Harrison had not thought about the Clare Monroe case in a very long time. It had been sitting in a file cabinet in his office for years, one of dozens of cold cases that accumulated in every police department across the country. Cases that went nowhere. Cases that had no leads, no evidence, no trail to follow. Cases that detectives kept because they were obligated to, not because they had any reason to believe they would ever be solved. But when Clare Monroe walked into his office that morning holding that envelope, something changed. Harrison read the note carefully, word by word. And he knew immediately that this was not a prank. This was not someone looking for attention or playing games. This was a real account. This was someone who had actually been there. Someone who had seen what happened and had been too afraid to come forward, but had finally, after all these years, found the courage to do so. Harrison had been a detective for over 2 decades. He had seen anonymous tips before. Had read hundreds of letters and notes and messages from people who claimed to have information about unsolved cases. Most of them were useless. Cranks, attention seekers, people with grudges looking for a way to cause trouble, well-meaning civilians who had convinced themselves they knew something when they actually did not. Harrison had learned, over years of experience, to read these things quickly and dismiss most of them just as quickly. This note was different. He knew it the moment he finished reading it. Not because of the tone, which was quiet and almost apologetic rather than dramatic or attention-seeking. Not because of the detail, which was specific enough to be credible but vague enough to suggest that the writer was deliberately holding something back. He knew it because of the shame in it. The quiet, unmistakable shame of someone who had done something wrong and was only now, years later, trying to make it right. That was not something a crank could fake. That was not something you put in a letter unless you actually felt it. This was a real witness. Someone who had been there. Someone who had seen what happened to Clare Monroe, and had been carrying that knowledge for 9 years. Harrison set the note down on his desk and sat back in his chair for a moment, thinking. 9 years. Someone had known for 9 years. Had watched Clare Monroe put up flyers and search and grieve and refuse to give up, had watched all of that from some vantage point that Harrison could not yet identify, and had said nothing. Had chosen silence over truth for 9 years. He did not judge the writer. Not yet. Not until he understood more about why. But he understood, in that moment, that this note was not just a break in the Clare Monroe case. It was a window into something larger. Into the kind of operation that could take a child and make her disappear so completely that an entire community, an entire police department, could look right at the aftermath and find nothing. Harrison picked up the phone and started making calls. Harrison reopened the Clare Monroe case that same afternoon. He started pulling records from 1998. He went back through every piece of evidence they had collected at the time, every report, every interview, every note from the original investigation. And then he started looking beyond Milbrook. He cross-referenced the Clare Monroe case with other missing children cases across New York State from the same time period and found something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. 4 other children. All of them between the ages of 2 and 4. All of them taken from front yards or driveways. All of them disappearing without a single witness coming forward. All of them vanishing in the same general region of New York State within a window of roughly 2 years. Same method. Same profile. Same impossible absence of evidence. This was not one isolated kidnapping. This was a pattern. And the pattern matched, almost exactly, the kind of operation that had just been shut down by federal agents a month earlier. The illegal adoption ring. Harrison contacted the FBI. He shared everything he had, the anonymous note, the details of the original Clare Monroe case, the pattern he had identified across the other missing children cases. The FBI shared back their own files. Complete records of the adoption ring's operations. Names, dates, locations, transaction records. A comprehensive picture of how the ring had operated for over 15 years, how they had identified and approached vulnerable children, how they had created false documents to make the adoptions appear legitimate, and how they had placed those children with families across the country. Harrison spent the next 2 weeks going through those records with the kind of focused intensity that comes when you know you are close to something. He was looking for one specific child. A girl. 3 years old in 1998. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. Taken from Milbrook, New York. Somewhere in the FBI's records, somewhere in the hundreds of transactions that the adoption ring had conducted over 15 years, was a placement that matched Clare Monroe. He narrowed the possibilities down to 17 girls who had been placed in New York State between April and June of 1998. 17 girls who were approximately the right age and who had been placed during the right time window. He started working through them systematically, one by one, checking birth records, hospital records, school enrollment dates, looking for inconsistencies, looking for documents that did not quite hold up under scrutiny. Most of the placements checked out. The paperwork was clean enough. The details matched up. But 3 of them did not. 3 placements where something was off. Birth records that showed suspiciously round dates. Hospitals that had no record of the births listed on the certificates. Physicians listed as attending doctors who had retired years before the births supposedly took place. 1 placement was in Albany. 1 was in Rochester. 1 was in Syracuse. Harrison requested photographs from the schools where these children were currently enrolled. Recent photos. Yearbook pictures. Anything current. The photos arrived over the course of 3 days. The girl in Albany was clearly not Clare. Different facial structure, different build, nothing about her matched the physical description or the age progression images that had been created for Clare Monroe over the years. Harrison moved on. The girl in Rochester was closer. Similar coloring. Similar general build. But when Harrison compared her photograph to the age progression images, the eyes were wrong. The shape of the face did not match. It was not her. And then Harrison looked at the third photograph. The girl from Syracuse. He stopped. He pulled up the age progression images on his computer, the images that had been generated by the FBI based on Clare Monroe's last known photographs, projecting what she might look like at various ages. He put them side by side with the photograph from the Syracuse school. The resemblance was striking. Not approximate. Not close. Striking. The same eyes. The same nose. The same slight dimple in the left cheek that showed up when she smiled. The same bone structure, the same jawline, the same everything that genetics does not change no matter how many years pass or how different the environment becomes. The file on this girl said her name was Lucy Walker. She was 12 years old. She was enrolled at Jefferson Middle School in Syracuse, New York. She was living with a couple named Robert and Susan Walker. And she had been placed with that family in April of 1998. Harrison read the transaction record. Robert and Susan Walker had paid $35,000 on April 10 of 1998. 5 days before Clare Monroe disappeared from her front yard in Milbrook. But the adoption had not been arranged on that date. The money had been paid in advance. The ring had already identified the Walkers as buyers, had already matched them with a child profile, weeks before they actually found Clare. The Walkers had been waiting. The ring had been looking for the right child to match their profile. And then they found her. Harrison felt his pulse quicken. This was Clare. He was almost certain of it. Everything matched. The timeline. The physical description. The fake documents. The transaction record. All of it pointed to one conclusion. But he could not act on a hunch. Could not show up at a family's home or a child's school and tell a 12-year-old girl that she had been stolen from her birth mother 9 years ago based on a photograph and a gut feeling. He needed proof. Scientific, undeniable proof. Harrison requested a court order for a DNA test. He submitted everything he had as evidence: the anonymous note, the fake birth certificate, the discrepancies in the hospital records, the physical resemblance between Lucy Walker and the age progression images of Clare Monroe, the transaction records linking the Walkers to the illegal adoption ring. The judge reviewed the evidence and granted the order, but with specific conditions. The test had to be conducted carefully. Therapists had to be present. The process had to be handled with sensitivity, with minimal disruption to the child's life, and with full awareness that Lucy Walker was a 12-year-old girl who had no idea any of this was coming. Harrison coordinated with the Syracuse Police Department, with the FBI, with Child Protective Services, and with a team of therapists who had experience working in cases involving children who had been separated from their biological families. They planned the approach carefully. They would not tell Lucy everything at once. They would not overwhelm her with the full weight of what had happened. They would explain step by step, gently, giving her time to process each piece of information before moving to the next. On May 2 of 2007, Harrison and 2 Child Protective Services workers arrived at Jefferson Middle School during Lucy Walker's lunch period. They asked to speak with her privately. Lucy Walker had never been in trouble at school. Had never been called out of class for any reason other than a routine appointment, or a parent pickup. So when she was told, in the middle of lunch, that some adults wanted to talk to her, her first reaction was simple confusion. Not fear, exactly. Not yet. Just the disorientation that comes when something unexpected happens in the middle of an ordinary day, and you do not yet have enough information to understand what it means. She walked with the school counselor through the hallway, past the rows of lockers and the bulletin boards covered in club announcements, and the faint background noise of 100 other students going about their lunch period as if nothing unusual were happening. Lucy felt the eyes of a few classmates on her as she passed. Wondered what they were thinking. Wondered if she was in trouble for something she did not know about. The counselor's office was small and warm. A couch, a couple of chairs, a desk pushed to one side. Lucy sat down in one of the chairs and looked at the 3 adults sitting across from her. She did not recognize any of them. The man in front introduced himself as Detective Harrison. Said he was from Milbrook. Said he was not there to get her in trouble. Said he just wanted to talk to her about something, and that they were going to take it slow. Lucy nodded. Her hands were fidgeting in her lap the way they always did when she was nervous. She looked at the therapist sitting beside her, a woman she had never met, who smiled at her gently and nodded as if to say, "It is okay. You are safe." Lucy did not know, sitting in that chair, that what was about to happen in the next 30 minutes would change the entire trajectory of her life. Did not know that the questions Harrison was about to ask were not routine questions, were not questions that had been asked of dozens of other kids that week. Did not know that her answers, the ones she gave without thinking, the ones she had been carrying inside her for years without understanding what they meant, were about to confirm something that a detective had been working toward for weeks. She just sat there, hands fidgeting, waiting to find out what this was about. And Harrison, on the other side of the table, took a breath and began. Lucy was brought to the counselor's office. She walked in looking confused and a little scared, the way any 12-year-old would when adults she had never seen before show up at her school and ask to talk to her. She sat down in a chair across from Harrison and the 2 CPS workers. A therapist sat beside her, close enough to offer support. Harrison introduced himself calmly. Told Lucy she was not in trouble. That no one was in trouble. That they just needed to talk to her about something, and that he was going to take it slow, one thing at a time, and she could ask questions whenever she wanted. He started with something simple. Asked Lucy what she remembered about being very young. Before school. Before she could remember things clearly. The earliest memories she had. Lucy thought about it for a moment. Said she remembered living with her parents, going to preschool, normal things. Nothing unusual. Harrison nodded. Asked if she remembered anything from even before that. From when she was very small. 3 years old or younger. Anything at all, even if it was vague. Even if it felt more like a dream than a memory. Lucy hesitated. There was a pause, a small but visible moment of uncertainty, as if she were deciding whether to say something she had kept to herself for a long time. She said sometimes she had dreams. Memories, maybe, that did not quite make sense. A house she did not recognize. A yard that looked different from the yard she grew up in. A voice she did not know, singing to her. And a name. Not her name. Someone else's name. Someone named Leah. Harrison felt something tighten in his chest. Leah. The imaginary friend. The name that had existed only in the private world shared between Clare Monroe and her 3-year-old daughter. The name that no one outside of that family had ever heard. He asked Lucy who Leah was. Lucy said she did not know. Said her mom, meaning Susan Walker, had told her it was just an imaginary friend. That lots of kids have them. That it was normal, and it did not mean anything. Harrison nodded again. Asked Lucy one more thing. Had she ever wondered, even once, if those memories might be real? If they were not dreams but actual memories from a time and a place she did not fully understand? Lucy looked uncomfortable. Said sometimes yes. Said sometimes it felt like she had lived somewhere else before Syracuse. Somewhere she could not quite remember. But that did not make sense, because she had always lived in Syracuse. That was what her parents said. That was what the documents said. That was the story she had grown up with. The therapist intervened gently at that point. Explained to Lucy, in careful and compassionate language, that sometimes children are placed with families through a process called adoption. That sometimes those adoptions are not done the way they are supposed to be done. That sometimes, in rare cases, children are taken from their birth families without the birth family's consent. Lucy's eyes widened. She looked at the therapist, then at Harrison, and asked, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, if that was what had happened to her. The therapist said they were not sure yet. Said they were investigating. Said they needed Lucy's help to find out the truth. And that the first step was a simple, painless test. A DNA test. They would take a small sample from the inside of her cheek, send it to a lab, and compare it to the DNA of someone who might be her biological mother. Lucy asked who that person was. Harrison told her name was Clare Monroe. That she lived in Milbrook, New York. That she had a daughter named Clare who had disappeared 9 years ago. That Clare would be 12 years old now. The same age as Lucy. Lucy sat with that information for a long time without speaking. Then she asked Harrison if he thought she was Clare. Harrison said he did not know for certain. Said the evidence suggested it was possible. Said the DNA test would tell them the truth, one way or the other. Lucy agreed to the test. They swabbed her cheek, collected the sample, and sent it to the lab. Results would take between 3 and 5 days. Harrison called Robert and Susan Walker that same evening to inform them of what was happening. Susan began crying almost immediately. Robert said they had not known. Said they had been told it was a legitimate private adoption. Said they had been given documents, had been assured by the people who arranged it that everything was legal and above board. Said they had no reason to believe otherwise. Harrison told them that the investigation into the adoption ring had raised serious questions about the legitimacy of their adoption. That Lucy was being tested. That the priority right now was Lucy, was finding out the truth about who she was doing what was best for her. The Walkers said they understood. Said they would cooperate fully with whatever the investigation required. 3 days later, the DNA results came back. 99.9% match. Lucy Walker was Clare Monroe. The perspective of Robert and Susan Walker is one of the more complicated threads in this story, because it forces a question that does not have a clean answer. At what point does willful ignorance become complicity? At what point does wanting something badly enough to stop asking questions cross the line from understandable human weakness into something more culpable? The Walkers had been trying to have a child for 15 years. 15 years of fertility treatments, of failed procedures, of hope and disappointment cycling endlessly. 15 years of watching other couples have babies, of fielding well-meaning questions from family and friends about when they were going to start a family, of carrying the particular kind of grief that comes from wanting something desperately, and being unable to get it through any of the channels that are supposed to work. When someone told them about the private adoption, they grabbed onto it the way a drowning person grabs onto anything that might keep them afloat. It was presented to them as a solution. Faster than the legal adoption process, which could take years. More reliable, which meant guaranteed. More expensive, yes, but the Walkers had money saved. They had been saving for this exact purpose, setting aside funds year after year in anticipation of the day when they would finally be able to bring a child home. The documents they were given looked legitimate. The birth certificate, the records from the hospital, the background information on the birth mother, all of it was professionally produced. Well made enough that the Walkers would have had to go to considerable effort to verify it independently, effort that would have required them to contact the hospital directly, to request the original birth records, to speak to the physician listed on the certificate, none of which they did. They did not do those things because they did not want to know. That is the honest truth of it, and it is the thing that the court ultimately held them accountable for. They did not want to look too closely at those documents because if they looked too closely, they might find something that would take this child away from them. And they wanted this child. They wanted her desperately. They had been wanting a child for 15 years. And here she was, right in front of them, a beautiful little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the paperwork said she was theirs. So they did not ask. Did not verify. Did not push back on any of the details, even the ones that did not quite add up. They just brought her home, and they loved her, and they raised her as their own. Were they bad people? That is not a question this story can answer with certainty. They were people who wanted something so badly that they were willing to look away from the truth in order to keep it. That is not unique to the Walkers. That is a deeply human tendency, one that shows up in all kinds of contexts, in all kinds of lives, in all kinds of situations where the truth and the desire are in conflict. But in this case, the truth they looked away from was the fact that a child had been stolen from her mother. And the desire they prioritized was their own. The court's ruling, guilty of negligence but not conspiracy, reflected this ambiguity. The Walkers had not planned the kidnapping, had not been part of the ring that orchestrated it, had not known, or at least had not admitted to knowing, that what they were participating in was illegal. But they had failed catastrophically to do the most basic due diligence that any responsible prospective parent should perform when adopting a child. They had chosen not to know. And a child had suffered because of that choice. Harrison had been in law enforcement long enough to know what it felt like when a case broke open. It was not always dramatic. It was not always a sudden flash of revelation. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was a number on a page, a line of text in a laboratory report, a single piece of evidence that confirmed what you had suspected for weeks but could not prove until that exact moment. This was one of those moments. Quiet. Still. Harrison sitting alone in his office with a piece of paper in his hands, reading the same numbers over and over, letting the meaning of them settle into him like rain soaking into dry ground. 99.9%. That was not a maybe. That was not a possibility. That was certainty. Lucy Walker was Clare Monroe. Had been Clare Monroe all along. Had been Clare Monroe every single day for 9 years, sitting in classrooms in Syracuse, eating dinner with the Walkers, going to sleep in a bedroom that was not the bedroom she was supposed to have, living a life that had been built entirely on theft. Harrison thought about Karen Monroe. About the flyers. About the walks home from the diner every day. About 9 years of a mother refusing to accept that her daughter was gone. He thought about Claire, about Lucy, about a 12-year-old girl who had been carrying fragments of a memory she did not understand, who had been told those fragments were dreams, who had spent her entire childhood believing something about herself that was not true. He thought about what was going to happen next. The phone call to Karen. The meeting. The moment when a mother and a daughter who did not know each other would sit in the same room for the first time in 9 years and try to figure out what they were to each other now. Harrison set the report down on his desk, picked up the phone, and dialed Karen Monroe's number. Harrison sat at his desk holding the report, staring at the numbers on the page, at the confirmation of what he had believed for weeks. 9 years. This child had been out there for 9 years, living under a name that was not hers, in a family that had no idea they had taken her from someone else. And the truth had been there the entire time, waiting to be found, locked away in the silence of one woman sitting at a window across the street from the house where Claire had last been seen. Harrison picked up the phone and called Karen Monroe. Told her to come to the station. Told her they had news about Claire. Just that. Nothing more. Nothing over the phone. Karen arrived 20 minutes later. She walked into Harrison's office and looked at his face and immediately knew that something had changed. Something was different. Harrison told her to sit down. He handed her the DNA report and explained what it meant, calmly and clearly, giving her time to absorb each sentence before moving to the next. They had found Claire. She was alive. She was healthy. She was safe. She was living in Syracuse, New York, under the name Lucy Walker. She was 12 years old. And she was, without any doubt, Karen's daughter. Karen could not speak. She sat in that chair holding the piece of paper that proved her daughter was alive, and she could not say a single word. She just cried. Silently, uncontrollably, the way a person cries when something they had almost stopped believing in turns out to be true after all. 9 years of grief. 9 years of searching. 9 years of walking the same route home every day, hoping for something, anything, some sign that Claire was still out there somewhere. All of it, in one moment, resolved. Harrison gave her time. Let her cry. Let her feel it. And then, when she was ready, He asked if she wanted to see Claire. If she was ready to meet her. Karen said yes. Said she had been ready for 9 years. But Harrison told her it would not be as simple as walking into a room and finding her daughter. Claire did not remember being Claire. She did not remember Karen. She had lived as Lucy Walker for 9 years. She believed the Walkers were her parents. She had grown up in Syracuse, gone to school there, made friends there, built an entire life there. The life she knew, the identity she had, all of it was built on the foundation of being Lucy Walker. Telling her the truth, showing her the evidence, introducing her to the woman who was actually her mother, all of that was going to take time. Patience. Professional support. It could not be rushed, and it could not be done carelessly. Lucy, Claire, whoever she was at this moment, was a 12-year-old girl who was about to have the ground pulled out from under her entire existence. That had to be handled with the greatest possible care. Karen said she understood. Said she did not need Claire to remember her right away. Did not need her to call her mom or feel anything she was not ready to feel. Just needed to see her. Just needed to know that she was real, that she was there, that she was alive. The meeting was arranged for May 7th. Lucy was given time to prepare, with the help of her therapist, to understand what was about to happen and what it meant. Karen was given time to prepare herself, to think about what she wanted to say, to figure out how to be in a room with a daughter she had not seen in 9 years who did not know she existed. On May 7th of 2007, Clare Monroe walked into a conference room at the Syracuse Family Services building. She sat down at a table and waited. A therapist sat nearby. The room was quiet. Neutral. Designed to feel as unthreatening as possible. The moment Clare Monroe walked into that conference room in Syracuse and saw her daughter for the first time in 9 years is not something that can be adequately described in words. It is one of those moments that exists outside the reach of language, one of those experiences that people who have lived through it spend the rest of their lives trying to articulate, and never quite succeeding. Karen had imagined this moment thousands of times over the course of 9 years. Had pictured it in 1,000 different ways. Claire running to her. Claire recognizing her. Claire calling her mom and falling into her arms, and everything that had been broken suddenly being whole again. Those were the fantasies that had sustained Karen through the darkest days of the search, the images she returned to when the grief threatened to become unbearable, the promises she made to herself about what would happen when Claire was found. The reality was nothing like any of those fantasies. Because the girl who walked into that room was not the 3-year-old Claire that Karen remembered. She was 12. She was taller than Karen had imagined. She was older in every possible way, not just physically but in the way she held herself, the way she looked at people, the guardedness in her expression that came from being told something life-altering and not yet knowing how to process it. And she did not recognize Karen. Not even a little. There was no flicker of recognition in Lucy's eyes when she looked at the woman sitting at the table. No sense of familiarity, no stirring of a memory that had been buried for 9 years. Lucy looked at Karen the way you look at any stranger, with curiosity, with a little wariness, with the particular discomfort of a teenager who has been put in an unfamiliar situation and does not know what is expected of her. Karen had to swallow everything she felt. Had to push down the overwhelming, almost physical urge to cross the room and hold this girl, to wrap her arms around her daughter and never let go. She could not do that. It would have been too much. Too fast. Too frightening for a 12-year-old who was already dealing with more than any 12-year-old should ever have to deal with. So Karen sat down. And she waited. And she let Lucy take her time. And she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, which was to be patient. To be present. To be in the same room as her daughter without demanding anything from her. Without needing anything from her. Just being there. Just letting Lucy know that she was real, that she was alive, that she was not going anywhere. It was, in its own way, one of the bravest things Karen ever did. Braver than the years of searching. Braver than the flyers and the phone calls and the walks along the same route. Because all of those things were driven by action, by the need to do something, to move, to keep searching. Sitting in that room and doing nothing, being nothing other than a quiet presence, required Karen to set aside the most powerful instinct she had, which was to hold her child, and trust that the moment would come when that was possible. And eventually it did. 5 minutes later, the door opened and Lucy Walker walked in. She was accompanied by her own therapist, who stayed close but did not hover. Lucy looked nervous. Her hands were fidgeting. Her eyes moved around the room, taking in the space, the people, the situation, trying to understand what was happening and what was expected of her. Karen stood up. She looked at her daughter for the first time in 9 years. Lucy had grown. Of course she had grown. She was no longer the tiny blonde girl in the yellow dress who had been sitting on a blanket in the front yard. She was 12 years old now. Taller. Older. Different in every way that time makes a child different. But the eyes were the same. The exact same eyes. The shape of her face was the same. The way she held herself, the slight tilt of her head when she was thinking, the way her hands moved when she was nervous. All of it was Clare. All of it was the daughter Karen had been looking for every single day for 9 years. Karen sat back down. Slowly. Carefully. She did not rush toward Lucy. Did not reach out and grab her and hold her the way every instinct in her body was telling her to. She sat down and she let Lucy take her time. Let her look. Let her process. The therapist explained to Lucy, gently, that this was Clare Monroe. That the DNA test had confirmed what they had suspected. That Lucy was, in fact, Clare. That the life she had been living, the family she had grown up with, the name she had been given, all of it had been built on a foundation that was not real. Lucy sat with that for a long time. Then she looked at Karen and asked if Karen remembered her. If she remembered what it was like before. Before Lucy. Before Syracuse. Before any of it. Karen said she remembered everything. Every single thing. She remembered the day Lucy was born. She remembered naming her Clare. She remembered every moment they had spent together, every morning, every evening, every afternoon in the front yard with the dolls and the blanket and Leia. She remembered all of it, and she had never stopped remembering, not for one single day in 9 years. Lucy said she did not remember any of that. Said she only remembered being Lucy. Only remembered the Walkers. Only remembered Syracuse. Karen said that was okay. Said Lucy did not have to remember. Did not have to feel anything she was not ready to feel. Did not have to change who she was or pretend to be someone she did not feel like. She just needed to know the truth. Needed to know that Karen had been looking for her. That Karen had never, not once, given up on finding her. They sat together for an hour. They talked. They cried. They began, very slowly, very carefully, the long and difficult process of rebuilding something that had been broken 9 years before either of them had any say in it. Robert and Susan Walker were charged with participating in an illegal adoption. They maintained throughout the proceedings that they had not known the adoption was illegal. That they had been deceived by the ring. That they had been given documents and assurances and had believed, genuinely believed, that everything was legitimate. The court found them guilty of negligence but not of conspiracy. They had not orchestrated the kidnapping. They had not known Clare had been taken. But they had failed to ask the questions they should have asked. They had looked away from details that did not add up because they wanted so badly to believe that the child they had been given was theirs to keep. They were sentenced to probation. They were barred from contact with Lucy, with Clare, pending her own decision about whether she wanted to see them in the future. Karen moved to Syracuse. Rented a small apartment. Got a job at a diner, the same kind of work she had always done, the same kind of work that had kept her and Clare fed and housed and safe for as long as it was within her power to keep them safe. She made herself available to Clare without being intrusive. Did not force contact. Did not demand anything. Just made sure Clare knew she was there, in the same city, whenever Clare was ready. Clare visited her once a week at first. They talked over meals. They shared time together in the careful, tentative way that two people share time when they are trying to figure out what they mean to each other. It was not easy. It was not fast. But it was real. And it was happening. Clare spent a year in therapy, working through what it meant to have two families. Two names. Two histories. Two versions of who she was and where she came from. Working through the grief of learning that the life she had known was not what she had been told it was. Working through the anger. The confusion. The strange, disorienting feeling of being told that everything you thought you knew about yourself was built on a lie. And eventually, Clare made a choice. She changed her name. Not back to Clare immediately, not all at once, but she chose to reclaim it. Said it felt right. Said it honored the person she had been before she was taken, and the person she was becoming now that she knew the truth. She chose to live with Karen. She started calling her mom. Not right away. Not on the first visit or the second or the 10th. But eventually. Gradually. Naturally. The way these things happen when two people are willing to be patient with each other. The process of becoming Clare again, after spending 9 years being Lucy, was not something that happened overnight. It was not a switch that flipped. It was not a single moment of clarity in which everything suddenly made sense and the broken pieces of her identity snapped into place like a puzzle completing itself. It was slow. It was messy. It was, at times, genuinely painful in ways that Clare had not expected and that no amount of preparation could have fully shielded her from. There were days when Clare felt nothing but anger. Anger at the Walkers for not asking the questions they should have asked. Anger at the ring that had taken her from her mother and sold her like a commodity. Anger at the system that had failed to find her for 9 years. Anger at herself, sometimes, for not remembering, for not knowing, for having lived an entire childhood without understanding that the life she was living was not the one she was supposed to have. There were days when she felt grief. Not just for the years she had lost with Karen, but for the childhood she had actually had. Because the truth about how she came to live with the Walkers did not erase the fact that she had loved them. Did not erase the birthday parties and the school plays and the quiet evenings watching television together, and the way Susan used to brush her hair before bed when she was small. Those memories were real. They belonged to her. And learning that they had been built on a stolen foundation did not make them disappear. It just made them complicated. Made them something she had to figure out how to hold alongside everything else she was learning about herself and her past. Clare's therapist helped her navigate all of it. Helped her understand that it was possible to grieve for a life that had been taken and also grieve for a life that had been given to her, and that both of those griefs were valid, and that neither one canceled the other out. Helped her understand that identity is not a single fixed thing but something that can be rebuilt, something that can incorporate all of the different versions of yourself that you have been along the way. Clare eventually settled into a place that felt like solid ground. Not because she had resolved every question or healed every wound. Some of those wounds would take years to heal, if they healed completely at all. But because she had found a way to hold all of it together, the girl she had been before she was taken, the girl she had been told she was, and the woman she was becoming now that she knew the truth, without any one of those versions canceling out the others. She was Clare Monroe. She had also been Lucy Walker. And she was, now, someone entirely new. Someone who carried both names inside her, who understood both histories, and who had the strength to move forward with all of it intact. 2 years after Clare Monroe was found, she stood at a podium at a national conference for families of missing children. The room was full. Cameras were recording. And Clare spoke. Her voice was steady. She did not shake. She did not cry, at least not visibly, not in front of the audience. She stood there and she told her story, from beginning to end. About being 3 years old and playing in the front yard. About a man who told her that her mommy had sent him. About waking up in a house she did not recognize and being told her name was not Clare anymore. About growing up as Lucy Walker, going to school, making friends, living what looked like a completely normal life while somewhere inside her, fragments of a different life kept surfacing in the middle of the night. About the DNA test. About the day she met Clare Monroe for the first time and looked into the eyes of the woman who had been searching for her for 9 years. And then Claire said something that stayed with everyone in that room long after the conference ended. She looked out at the audience, and she said, "If there is another child out there right now, living under a name that is not theirs, with a family that did not know what they were really doing when they brought that child home, and if there is a mother somewhere in this country who has not stopped looking, who walks the same route every day hoping for a sign, and if there is a witness somewhere who saw something and has been too afraid to say a word, find the courage. Tell the truth. Because someone gave me my life back. And someone else deserves that chance too." Clare Monroe sat in the audience that day and watched her daughter speak. Watched her stand at that podium and turn everything that had been done to her into something that might help someone else. Watched her become someone neither Claire nor Lucy had been before. Someone new. Someone whole. Someone who had been broken and put back together, and come out the other side stronger than either piece had been on its own. And somewhere across the country, in a small house in Milbrook, New York, with a window that faced Maple Street, Diane Foster sat in her chair and watched Clare Monroe speak on television. Watched her stand up there in front of all those people and tell the truth about what had happened. Watched Karen sitting in the audience with tears running down her face. Watched what her own courage, that single act of finally speaking after 9 years of silence, had made possible. And for the first time in 9 years, Diane Foster did not feel like a coward. Clare Monroe was stolen at age 3. She was given a new name, a new family, and a new life. She was raised to forget who she really was, and for 9 years she did. But a witness remembered. A witness who had been watching from across the street for almost a decade, carrying the weight of what she had seen and what she had not done, finally found the strength to speak. And a detective who refused to let a cold case stay cold followed the thread all the way to the end. And Claire came home. Someone is still missing right now. As you listen to this, there is a mother somewhere who has not stopped searching. There is a child somewhere who does not know who they really are. There is a witness somewhere who saw something and has been too afraid to say a word. Think about what it took for this story to end the way it did. Think about every single person who had to do something difficult, something uncomfortable, something that cost them something, in order for Clare Monroe to come home. Karen had to keep going for 9 years without knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. Had to get up every morning and go to work and walk the same route and put up the same flyers and make the same phone calls and keep believing in something that most people around her had quietly stopped believing in. She had to refuse to accept the most natural, most understandable response to what happened to her, which was to give up. And she refused. Every single day. For 9 years. Diane had to overcome a fear that had kept her inside her own house for years. Had to walk out her front door on a morning when every cell in her body was screaming at her to stay home. Had to open her mouth and say a word that she had been keeping locked inside herself for almost a decade. Had to find the courage to do one small, quiet, almost invisible thing that turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Harrison had to look at a cold case that no one else was paying attention to and decide it was worth his time. Had to connect dots that had not been connected before. Had to build a case carefully enough that it would hold up, gently enough that a 12-year-old girl would not be destroyed by it, and thoroughly enough that the truth would come out completely and permanently. And Claire herself had to do something that no child should ever have to do. Had to accept that everything she thought she knew about herself was wrong. Had to grieve for a childhood that had been stolen, and also grieve for a childhood that had been given to her under false pretenses. Had to figure out who she was in a world that had been lying to her for as long as she could remember. And she did it. Not perfectly, not without pain, not without tears and anger and confusion. But she did it. She found her way back to her own name. And she found the strength to stand in front of a room full of strangers and tell her story so that someone else's story might turn out differently. That is what it took. Not one dramatic moment. Not one hero. But a chain of people, each one doing the hardest thing they were capable of doing, each one pushing through their own fear or grief or limitation, each one making a choice that moved things one step closer to the truth. And the truth, in the end, did what truth always does when it is finally allowed to come out. It brought someone home. Do not give up. Do not stop looking. Do not stay silent. Because what happened to Clare Monroe proves that it is never too late. That the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, can still come to the surface. That one word, said by one person at the right moment, can change everything. If this story stayed with you, if it kept you watching, if it made you feel something you cannot quite shake, then you already know what I need from you. If you are still here after everything we just went through together, drop a comment right now and tell me that you made it to the end. I want to know who is paying attention. I want to know who stayed. Like this video because this story deserves to be seen by as many people as possible. Every view, every share, every comment, is another chance for someone out there to hear Clare's story and think about what they might know, what they might have seen, what they might be too afraid to say. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss a single one. Share this with someone you know. Because Clare's story does not end when this video ends. It keeps going. It keeps reaching people. And every person it reaches is another chance for someone to come forward. Another chance for a missing child to come home. Clare Monroe's story is not unique. There are other children out there right now, living under names that are not theirs, with families that do not know what they really did to bring that child into their home. There are other mothers out there right now, walking the same routes, putting up the same flyers, refusing to stop believing that their child is still out there somewhere. And there are other witnesses out there right now, sitting in their own chairs, behind their own windows, carrying their own secrets, too afraid to say what they know. If that is you, if any part of this story sounds familiar, if you know something you have been afraid to say, this is your moment. This is your chance. The truth does not expire. It does not have a time limit. It does not become less powerful because years have passed. If anything, it becomes more powerful. Because every year that passes is another year that someone is still missing. Another year that a family is still broken. Another year that the silence continues. Break it. This has been 72-Hour True Crime. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for not looking away.